Your metabolism isn't broken. I want to say that clearly right at the start, because I think an enormous number of people watching this have spent years believing something about their own body that the actual research simply doesn't support. You've probably heard the phrase starvation mode, the idea that if you eat too little for too long, your metabolism essentially shuts down in self-defense, making it nearly impossible to lose weight, no matter how disciplined you are. You've probably also heard people explain away years of failed dieting by saying their metabolism is simply slow, broken, or damaged from years of yo-yo dieting, crash diets, or just bad genetics. I want to walk you through what the actual physiology says about metabolic rate, what genuinely happens to your metabolism when you diet, why the popular broken metabolism narrative gets the mechanism almost entirely backward, and what's actually going on for most people who feel stuck despite doing everything they think they're supposed to be doing. This is going to be a long, detailed conversation because I think this topic deserves considerably more nuance than the 5-minute explainer videos that usually cover it. So let's get into it properly. Let's start with the basics, because I think a lot of the confusion around metabolism starts with people not actually knowing what the word refers to physiologically. Your total daily energy expenditure, the total number of calories your body burns in a day, is made up of several distinct components, and understanding these components individually is essential for understanding why the broken metabolism narrative doesn't hold up the way people assume it does. The largest component for most people is your basal metabolic rate, sometimes called resting metabolic rate, which represents the energy your body needs simply to keep you alive, breathing, circulating blood, maintaining organ function, regulating body temperature, all while completely at rest. And this typically accounts for somewhere between 60 and 70% of total daily energy expenditure for a sedentary individual. Citation: this general breakdown of total daily energy expenditure components is well established in metabolic physiology literature, discussed extensively in textbooks and reviews on human energy metabolism. The second major component is the thermic effect of food, the energy your body expends simply digesting, absorbing, and processing the food you eat, which typically accounts for somewhere around 10% of total daily energy expenditure, though this varies somewhat based on the macronutrient composition of your diet, since protein specifically carries a notably higher thermic effect than carbohydrate or fat, requiring more energy to digest and process relative to its caloric content. Citation: this differential thermic effect across macronutrients has been examined extensively in nutritional research published in journals, including the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. The third component is exercise activity thermogenesis, the energy burned through structured, intentional exercise, which for most people represents a relatively modest portion of total daily expenditure, often less than you'd expect, particularly for people who aren't training multiple hours daily. And the fourth component, which I think is genuinely the most underappreciated and most important piece of this entire conversation, is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, often abbreviated NEAT, which refers to all the energy you burn through everyday movement that isn't structured: exercise, fidgeting, walking around your house, taking the stairs, standing rather than sitting, the countless small movements that make up an ordinary day outside of a gym session. Citation: this framework of total daily energy expenditure components, including the specific contribution of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, was established through foundational metabolic research published by researchers including James Levine in journals including Science and subsequent review literature. I want to spend real time on NEAT specifically because I think this is actually the central mechanism explaining why so many people believe their metabolism has become broken or damaged, when what's actually happening is something considerably more mundane, but also, I think, considerably more useful to understand. Because unlike your basal metabolic rate, NEAT is something you have meaningful, direct control over. Research has found that non-exercise activity thermogenesis can vary dramatically between individuals by as much as 2,000 calories daily between two people of similar size and composition, based almost entirely on how much incidental movement they engage in throughout an ordinary day. Citation: This dramatic individual variation in NEAT and its substantial contribution to total energy expenditure differences between individuals was demonstrated in overfeeding research published by Levine and colleagues in Science, 1,999. This is a genuinely staggering range when you actually sit with it. 2,000 calories is roughly equivalent to an entire additional day's worth of food for many people. And the entire difference can come down to how much someone naturally fidgets, walks, and moves throughout their day, completely separate from anything happening at the gym. Here's why this matters enormously for the broken metabolism conversation. When someone diets for an extended period, particularly if that diet involves a significant sustained caloric deficit, research has consistently found that NEAT tends to decrease considerably, often without the person consciously noticing or intending it. Citation. This phenomenon of NEAT declining during periods of caloric restriction has been demonstrated across multiple controlled feeding studies, including research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition examining changes in spontaneous physical activity during dieting. People who are dieting tend to unconsciously move less. They take the elevator instead of the stairs without really deciding to. They sit rather than stand. They fidget less. Their spontaneous movement throughout the day gradually diminishes. And this isn't laziness or a conscious choice. It appears to be a largely unconscious, physiologically driven adaptation to reduced energy availability, one of the body's genuine, real ways of conserving energy during a period of caloric restriction. This is genuinely important because it means a meaningful portion of what people experience as their metabolism slowing down during a diet isn't actually a change in their basal metabolic rate at all. The core resting energy expenditure that keeps their organs functioning, it's a change in how much they're unconsciously moving throughout the day. And this distinction matters enormously for how you should think about and respond to a weight loss plateau. Because if you believe your basal metabolism itself has become damaged or broken, the natural response feels almost fatalistic. There's nothing you can really do about it. But if the actual mechanism is largely about unconscious reductions in daily movement, that's something genuinely, directly actionable in a way that a supposedly broken basal metabolic rate wouldn't be. I want to bring in the research on actual basal metabolic rate changes during dieting now, because I don't want to overstate my point and suggest that literally nothing changes about your resting metabolism during a diet. That wouldn't be accurate either. And I think the honest, complete picture involves acknowledging a real phenomenon while correcting the exaggerated, catastrophized version of it that's become so popular online. There is a genuine, well-documented phenomenon called adaptive thermogenesis, sometimes referred to as metabolic adaptation, where basal metabolic rate does decrease somewhat during sustained caloric restriction beyond what would simply be predicted by the loss of body mass itself, meaning your metabolism does slow down by somewhat more than you'd expect purely from having less total tissue to maintain satiation, this phenomenon of adaptive thermogenesis. A metabolic rate reduction exceeding what's predicted purely by tissue loss has been demonstrated across numerous controlled studies, including foundational research examining the Minnesota starvation experiment and subsequent, more contemporary research on caloric restriction and metabolic adaptation. Let me talk about the Minnesota starvation experiment specifically, because I think it's genuinely one of the most important pieces of historical research underlying our modern understanding of this entire topic. Even though it was conducted decades ago under conditions that would never be ethically approved for research today, conducted in the 1940s, this study placed a group of healthy young men on a semi-starvation diet, roughly half of their normal caloric intake, for a period of 24 weeks, and meticulously documented the physiological and psychological changes that occurred. Citation: this research is documented extensively in the published account of the Minnesota starvation experiment by Ansel Keys and colleagues, and has been referenced repeatedly in subsequent metabolic adaptation research as a foundational, if historically situated, source of data on prolonged severe caloric restriction in humans. The participants experienced a meaningful drop in basal metabolic rate, considerably beyond what would be predicted purely by their loss of body weight and lean tissue during the study, alongside dramatic psychological changes, including preoccupation with food, irritability, and depression, that have become an important cautionary reference point for understanding just how severely the body and mind respond to genuinely severe, prolonged caloric deprivation. Citation: these documented psychological and metabolic changes from the Minnesota starvation experiment have been referenced extensively in subsequent research on the physiological and psychological effects of severe caloric restriction. I want to be genuinely careful here about what this historical research does and doesn't tell us about typical modern dieting, because I think this is where a lot of popularized starvation mode content goes wrong by taking findings from genuinely extreme, prolonged semi-starvation and applying them uncritically to describe what happens to someone eating a moderate, sensible caloric deficit for a few months while trying to lose 20 or 30 pounds. The Minnesota starvation experiment involved roughly a 50% reduction in caloric intake sustained for 24 consecutive weeks in already lean young men who had essentially no meaningful body fat reserves to spare. This is an entirely different physiological scenario from a moderate, well-structured deficit of perhaps 500 to 750 calories daily in someone carrying a meaningful amount of excess body fat, which describes the situation for the vast majority of people watching a video like this who are trying to lose weight through reasonable, sustainable dieting. Let's look at research examining more realistic, moderate caloric deficits specifically, because I think this gives a considerably more applicable and considerably less alarming picture of what actually happens metabolically during typical sensible dieting. Studies examining moderate caloric restriction over periods of several weeks to months have generally found metabolic adaptation effects that are real, but considerably more modest than the extreme starvation research would suggest. Typically in the range of a 5 to 15% reduction in metabolic rate beyond what's predicted by tissue loss alone, rather than anything approaching the dramatic, catastrophic metabolic shutdown implied by popular starvation mode framing. Citation: this more moderate magnitude of metabolic adaptation during realistic caloric deficits has been examined across multiple controlled studies, summarized in reviews published in journals including obesity reviews on adaptive thermogenesis during weight loss interventions. I want to bring in one specific widely discussed study here because I think it's become something of a cultural touch point for the broken metabolism narrative, and I think it deserves careful, honest examination rather than either uncritical acceptance or dismissal. Researchers followed contestants from a televised weight loss competition who had lost extremely large amounts of weight extremely rapidly through a combination of severe caloric restriction and extreme exercise volume, and found that 6 years after the competition, their resting metabolic rates remained substantially below what would be predicted for their body size, even in contestants who had regained a meaningful portion of the weight they'd originally lost. Citation: Fothergill and colleagues, Obesity, 2016, Persistent Metabolic Adaptation 6 years after a major weight loss competition. This study understandably generated enormous public attention and became widely cited as definitive proof of permanently broken metabolisms following dieting. I want to walk through why I think this specific study, while genuinely important and worth taking seriously, has been somewhat overextended in its popular interpretation because the conditions these contestants experienced were, once again, genuinely extreme and quite different from typical moderate dieting approaches. These were individuals losing extraordinarily large amounts of weight, in some cases well over 100 pounds, over remarkably short time frames, through a combination of severe caloric restriction, critically extremely high volumes of intense exercise, conditions that are considerably more physiologically extreme than the moderate deficit and reasonable exercise volume that responsible, sustainable weight loss guidance actually recommends. Citation: this context regarding the specific extreme conditions experienced by the study's competition-based population is discussed in the original Fothergill study and subsequent commentary examining its applicability to typical dieting scenarios. Some researchers examining this same data set have also pointed out that a meaningful portion of the observed metabolic rate reduction may relate to disproportionate loss of metabolically active lean tissue during such an extreme, rapid weight loss process, rather than purely to some independent, mysterious damage to metabolic regulation itself, meaning at least part of what's being measured as a persistently lowered metabolic rate reflects these individuals having less actual muscle and organ tissue to maintain, a genuinely different phenomenon from a fixed regulatory system somehow permanently malfunctioning. Citation, this alternative interpretation, emphasizing disproportionate lean tissue loss as a meaningful contributor to persistently lowered metabolic rate following extreme rapid weight loss, has been discussed in subsequent analysis and commentary on the Fothergill research. I also want to mention that this specific competition-based study, while genuinely valuable and worth taking seriously, represents a single data point drawn from a fairly unusual, extreme population and broader research examining metabolic adaptation following more typical moderate weight loss approaches has generally found the degree of persistent adaptation to be considerably smaller and, importantly, to substantially improve or resolve over time following the return to a stable, adequate caloric intake, rather than representing the permanent, essentially unfixable metabolic damage that gets implied in a lot of popularized discussion of this topic, the citation. This generally more favorable and reversible pattern of metabolic adaptation following moderate, typical weight loss approaches has been examined across a broader body of caloric restriction and metabolic rate research summarized in reviews published in Obesity Reviews and the International Journal of Obesity. Let me talk now about what actually happens when someone stops dieting and returns to a higher caloric intake, because I think this is genuinely one of the more encouraging and more commonly overlooked pieces of this entire body of research. Research on metabolic recovery following a period of caloric restriction has generally found that basal metabolic rate tends to recover substantially, often close to fully, once caloric intake returns to an adequate, sustained level, particularly when that increase in intake is accompanied by regaining some of the lean muscle mass that's commonly lost during aggressive dieting. Citation, this pattern of substantial metabolic rate recovery following the return to adequate caloric intake has been examined in research on metabolic adaptation reversal, published in journals including the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is genuinely important because the popular broken metabolism narrative often implies a kind of permanent, essentially unfixable damage, when the actual research suggests something considerably more optimistic, that the metabolic slowdown experienced during dieting is largely, though perhaps not entirely in every case, a temporary, adaptive response to reduced energy availability rather than a fixed, permanent alteration to your body's fundamental metabolic machinery. I want to bring in the concept of a diet break or planned refeed here because I think this connects directly and practically to everything we've just discussed. Research examining structured, planned breaks from caloric restriction, periods of 1 to 2 weeks where caloric intake is deliberately raised back to maintenance levels during an otherwise extended dieting phase, has found that this approach can help mitigate some of the metabolic adaptation and psychological fatigue associated with prolonged, continuous caloric restriction without meaningfully compromising overall weight loss progress across the full duration of a longer dieting period. Citation, Byrne and colleagues. International Journal of Obesity, 2018. Comparison of continuous caloric restriction against restriction with planned intermittent diet breaks, examining effects on weight loss and metabolic adaptation. This research genuinely supports something practical and actionable, that periodically returning to maintenance calories during an extended weight loss journey isn't simply a psychological convenience. It may carry genuine metabolic benefit as well, helping to counteract some of the adaptive thermogenesis and NEAT reduction that tends to accumulate during long, continuous periods of caloric restriction. If you want the complete structured framework for actually implementing diet breaks properly, calculating your own realistic caloric targets, and tracking whether your own metabolism is adapting in a way that warrants adjustment, I put together a couple of ebooks that walk through this in a lot more practical detail than I can cover in a single video. They're linked down in the description below. And if you're someone who's genuinely struggled with feeling stuck despite doing everything you think you're supposed to be doing, I'd honestly encourage you to go check them out because that's exactly the kind of practical gap they're designed to fill. Let's talk now about muscle mass specifically, since it connects directly to basal metabolic rate and represents one of the most genuinely actionable, evidence-supported levers available for anyone concerned about their metabolic rate long-term. Skeletal muscle, even at rest, is more metabolically active than fat tissue, meaning it requires more energy to simply maintain. And research has found that individuals with greater lean muscle mass tend to have correspondingly higher basal metabolic rates independent of total body weight. Citation: this relationship between lean muscle mass and basal metabolic rate has been established extensively in metabolic physiology research, discussed in reviews on body composition and energy expenditure. I want to be honest that the specific, often cited figure that each additional pound of muscle burns some dramatic, specific number of extra calories daily tends to be somewhat exaggerated in popular fitness content. The actual per pound contribution of muscle tissue to resting energy expenditure is more modest than commonly claimed, generally estimated in the range of roughly 6 calories per pound of muscle daily at rest, considerably less dramatic than some popularized figures suggest. Citation: this more modest, accurately estimated per pound contribution of muscle tissue to resting metabolic rate has been discussed in metabolic physiology research, correcting some of the more exaggerated figures that circulate in popular fitness content. That said, and this is genuinely important, the cumulative effect of building and maintaining meaningfully more muscle mass over time, combined with the fact that resistance training itself, separate from the muscle tissue's resting contribution, produces its own additional caloric expenditure, both during training sessions and for a period afterward, through a phenomenon called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, means that consistent resistance training represents a genuinely meaningful, evidence-supported strategy for supporting a healthier metabolic rate over the long term, particularly important given the age-related muscle loss, sarcopenia, that we've discussed extensively in previous videos, which itself represents one of the more well-documented, genuine contributors to declining metabolic rate as people age. Citation: this relationship between age-related muscle loss and declining metabolic rate, and the role of resistance training in mitigating this decline has been examined in research on sarcopenia and metabolic health published in journals, including the Journal of Applied Physiology. Let me address age directly here, because I think this is one of the more genuinely legitimate evidence-supported factors that people sometimes lump together with the less accurate broken metabolism narrative, and I want to separate the two clearly. It is genuinely true that basal metabolic rate tends to decline somewhat with age, though the research on the specific magnitude and timing of this decline has actually been somewhat revised in recent years by more sophisticated research than was previously available. A large, comprehensive study analyzing metabolic rate data across thousands of individuals ranging from infancy through old age found that metabolic rate, when properly adjusted for body composition, actually remains relatively stable throughout most of adulthood from roughly age 20 to age 60, with a more meaningful decline beginning primarily after age 60, considerably later in life than the commonly assumed narrative of a steady, gradual metabolic slowdown beginning in someone's 20s or 30s. Citation: Poncer and colleagues, Science, 2021, comprehensive analysis of total energy expenditure across the human lifespan using doubly labeled water measurements. I think this finding is genuinely important and deserves real attention because it directly challenges another commonly repeated version of the broken metabolism narrative, the idea that metabolism inevitably gradually slows year after year throughout normal adulthood, making weight management progressively, inexorably harder simply due to the passage of time. The more accurate picture, based on this considerably more rigorous, large-scale research using doubly labeled water, a gold standard measurement technique for total energy expenditure, is that much of what people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s experience as a slowing metabolism is more likely attributable to other factors entirely, particularly declining muscle mass from reduced physical activity, and the natural, though non-inevitable, sarcopenia process we discussed earlier, combined with lifestyle-related reductions in NEAT, rather than to age itself directly producing some inevitable built-in metabolic slowdown purely as a function of years past. Citation, this reinterpretation of age-related metabolic changes, attributing much of the commonly observed slowdown to secondary factors like declining muscle mass and activity levels rather than age itself as a primary independent driver, is discussed in commentary and subsequent research building on the Ponser 2021 findings. This distinction matters enormously practically because it shifts the narrative from something essentially fatalistic, my metabolism is simply doomed to slow down as I age and there's nothing meaningful I can do about it, towards something genuinely actionable. The specific factors most responsible for what people experience as age-related metabolic decline, muscle loss, and reduced activity levels are things you have genuine, direct influence over through consistent resistance training and maintaining adequate daily movement rather than passively accepting metabolic decline as an unavoidable consequence of simply getting older. Let me address something about genetics here, since this is another piece of the broken metabolism narrative that deserves honest, nuanced treatment rather than either dismissal or uncritical acceptance. There is genuine individual variation in metabolic rate that exists independent of body composition, activity level, or dieting history, meaning some people genuinely do have somewhat higher or lower basal metabolic rates than others of similar size and composition, for reasons that appear to relate to genuine genetic variation in factors including mitochondrial efficiency and thyroid function. Citation. This genuine individual genetic variation in basal metabolic rate, independent of body composition, has been examined in twin studies and broader research on the heritability of metabolic rate published in journals, including the American Journal of Physiology. However, and this is genuinely important, the magnitude of this individual genetic variation is considerably smaller than most people assume, typically representing differences of perhaps a few hundred calories daily between individuals of otherwise similar size and composition, rather than the dramatic, seemingly impossible to overcome differences that people sometimes attribute to their own perceived slow metabolism. Citation. This more modest, realistic magnitude of genetic variation in metabolic rate, correcting some of the more exaggerated popular claims about dramatically slow individual metabolisms, is discussed in metabolic physiology research addressing common misconceptions about metabolic rate variation. I want to address thyroid function specifically here as well, since this is a genuine medically important factor that absolutely can affect metabolic rate, and I don't want anything in this video to be read as dismissing legitimate medical conditions. Hypothyroidism, a condition where the thyroid gland produces insufficient thyroid hormone, genuinely does reduce basal metabolic rate, sometimes substantially, and is a well-established, medically recognized cause of unexplained weight gain or difficulty losing weight, along with other symptoms including fatigue, cold intolerance, and hair thinning. Citation. This well-established relationship between hypothyroidism and reduced metabolic rate is foundational, well-documented endocrinology, discussed extensively in clinical endocrinology literature and guidelines published by organizations including the American Thyroid Association. If you're experiencing persistent, unexplained difficulty with weight management alongside other symptoms consistent with thyroid dysfunction, that's a genuine, important reason to seek proper medical evaluation and thyroid function testing, rather than assuming your struggles are purely behavioral or attempting to self-diagnose based on general population research like what we've discussed throughout most of this video. This is a case where a genuine medically diagnosable condition can meaningfully affect metabolism, and it deserves proper medical evaluation rather than either self-diagnosis or dismissal. That said, and this is worth being honest about, population-level research suggests that clinically significant diagnosable hypothyroidism represents a relatively modest proportion of the general population experiencing weight management difficulty, and the overwhelming majority of people who attribute their weight struggles to a slow thyroid or a broken metabolism without an actual clinical diagnosis do not, upon proper testing, turn out to have a genuine thyroid abnormality, citation needed for precise current population-level prevalence statistics, specifically distinguishing clinically diagnosed hypothyroidism from self-attributed, undiagnosed metabolic explanations for weight struggles, since this specific comparative statistic is difficult to establish with precision given the self-reported, non-clinically verified nature of a large portion of the relevant population data. This isn't meant to dismiss anyone's genuine struggle, but rather to encourage getting an actual medical evaluation and diagnosis if you suspect a genuine underlying condition, rather than either assuming the worst without testing or assuming your specific case must be different from what the broader research shows without ever actually checking. Let me bring the conversation back to what I think is genuinely the central, most practically important theme running through this entire video, which is the gap between subjective caloric intake tracking and actual caloric intake, because I think this represents a huge underappreciated piece of why people experience what feels like an inexplicably broken metabolism, when the actual explanation is often considerably more mundane, though genuinely not a matter of blame or moral failing, since this appears to reflect genuine, well-documented limitations in human perception and memory around food intake rather than intentional dishonesty. Research directly comparing people's self-reported caloric intake against their actual measured intake using objective methods like doubly labeled water to verify true total energy expenditure has consistently found substantial underreporting, with some studies finding that people significantly underestimate their actual caloric intake, sometimes by considerable margins, particularly among individuals who identify as struggling with weight management despite believing they're eating appropriately for their goals. Citation, Lichtman and colleagues, New England Journal of Medicine, 1992. Discrepancy between self-reported and objectively measured energy intake and expenditure in individuals reporting difficulty losing weight despite low reported caloric intake. This particular study is genuinely one of the more important, if somewhat uncomfortable, pieces of research in this entire conversation, because it directly examined a group of people who were convinced their metabolism must be uniquely resistant to weight loss, given how little they believed they were eating relative to their lack of progress, and found, through objective measurement, that their actual caloric intake was considerably higher than what they had reported, while their actual measured metabolic rate was entirely normal for their body size and composition. I want to be genuinely careful and empathetic in how I present this finding, because I think it's easy for this kind of research to come across as dismissive or accusatory, implying people are simply lying about what they eat. And I don't think that's the accurate or fair interpretation of what's actually happening here. The research on this phenomenon suggests it's considerably more about genuine, well-documented limitations in human memory and perception around food intake, small bites and tastes while cooking that go unconsciously unregistered, underestimation of portion sizes, particularly for calorie-dense foods like oils, nuts, and dressings, where visual portion estimation is notoriously inaccurate and inconsistent or incomplete tracking on certain days that don't get factored into someone's overall sense of their average intake, rather than deliberate deception, citation, this body of research on the specific mechanisms underlying caloric intake, underreporting, emphasizing perceptual and memory limitations rather than intentional misrepresentation, has been examined extensively in nutritional epidemiology literature on dietary assessment accuracy. This is genuinely, I think, one of the more important, if less immediately satisfying, pieces of the entire broken metabolism conversation, because it suggests that for a meaningful proportion of people who feel stuck despite what they believe is a genuinely restrictive diet, the actual explanation isn't a mysteriously damaged metabolism at all. It's a gap between perceived and actual caloric intake that's considerably more common and considerably more human and understandable than most people assume, particularly given how genuinely difficult, accurate, comprehensive food tracking is without deliberate, careful measurement using tools like a kitchen scale rather than visual estimation alone. Let me talk about exercise compensation now, since this is a closely related phenomenon that I think deserves genuine, direct attention in this conversation, because it connects both to the neat discussion from earlier and to this broader theme of the gap between perceived and actual net caloric balance. Research has found that people frequently, often unconsciously, compensate for structured exercise by both eating somewhat more afterward, sometimes rationalizing the additional food as earned through the workout, and by unconsciously reducing their NEAT for the remainder of the day, essentially becoming somewhat more sedentary outside of the gym, specifically because they've already completed a formal workout citation. This phenomenon of both dietary and non-exercise activity compensation following structured exercise has been examined in research on the disconnect between exercise-based caloric expenditure and actual net changes in total daily energy balance, published in journals including Obesity Reviews. This is genuinely important context for anyone who has increased their exercise volume, specifically hoping to accelerate weight loss, only to find their progress considerably slower than the calculated caloric expenditure of their workouts would seem to predict. And it's yet another piece of this puzzle that has nothing to do with a genuinely broken metabolism and everything to do with the complex, often unconscious ways our behavior adjusts around changes to our exercise and eating patterns. I want to spend some time now addressing metabolic rate testing specifically, since a growing number of people, understandably curious about their own individual metabolic rate, given everything we've discussed, are seeking out direct measurement, whether through commercial metabolic testing services or through devices marketed for home use. The gold standard method for measuring resting metabolic rate is indirect calorimetry, which measures your oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production while at rest to calculate your actual energy expenditure. And this can provide genuinely useful, individualized information, particularly for someone who suspects their metabolic rate might genuinely differ substantially from population-based formula estimates, citation. This indirect calorimetry methodology and its established accuracy for measuring individual resting metabolic rate is well established in metabolic physiology and clinical nutrition literature. I want to be honest, though, that consumer-grade metabolic testing devices, as opposed to properly calibrated clinical or research-grade equipment, vary considerably in their accuracy, and some validation research has found meaningful discrepancies between certain commercial devices and true gold standard measurement, citation. This variable accuracy of consumer-grade metabolic testing devices compared to gold standard indirect calorimetry has been examined in validation research published in journals including Medicine and Science, in Sports and Exercise. If you're genuinely curious about your own individual metabolic rate, seeking out a properly calibrated clinical-grade testing facility rather than a lower-cost consumer device of uncertain accuracy will give you considerably more reliable, trustworthy information. Though I want to emphasize that for the vast majority of people, the practical, actionable takeaways from this video don't actually require this kind of individual testing to be useful. Let me address something about the psychological dimension of the broken metabolism narrative here, because I think this deserves genuine, compassionate attention rather than purely clinical discussion of the physiology alone. Believing your metabolism is fundamentally broken, damaged beyond repair through years of past dieting, or simply through bad genetic luck, can become a genuinely powerful, self-reinforcing narrative that shapes behavior in ways that make actual progress considerably harder, not because the belief itself directly changes your physiology, but because it can lead to a kind of learned helplessness around weight management, where consistent, evidence-based effort starts to feel pointless given the assumed futility of fighting against a permanently damaged system. Citation needed for direct psychological research, specifically quantifying this relationship between believing one's metabolism is broken and subsequent behavioral patterns. Since this connects to broader, well-established psychological research on self-efficacy and behavior change, more than to a distinctly separate, dedicated body of research specifically on metabolism-related beliefs. But the general principle that expectancy and self-efficacy beliefs meaningfully influence health behavior persistence is well established in behavioral psychology and health behavior change literature. I think this is genuinely one of the more important, if less scientifically flashy, reasons this entire topic deserves careful, honest treatment, because an inaccurate, overly fatalistic belief about your own metabolism can become a genuine barrier to the kind of sustained, patient effort that the actual research suggests is both necessary and genuinely effective for meaningful, lasting change. If any of this is resonating with you and you're looking for a complete, practical system for actually tracking your intake accurately, calculating a realistic caloric target based on your actual individual numbers rather than generic formulas alone, and building sustainable habits around movement and resistance training that support your metabolic health long-term, that's exactly the kind of detailed, practical material I put together in the ebooks linked in the description below. I built them because I think a video like this can walk you through the reasoning and correct the misconceptions, but actually implementing accurate tracking and a sustainable plan benefits enormously from having a structured system to follow. So if this topic has genuinely been a source of frustration for you, I'd really encourage you to go check them out. Let me now bring together everything we've discussed into a practical, evidence-based framework for what to actually do if you feel stuck, because I think this is where this entire conversation needs to land, moving from correcting misconceptions toward genuinely actionable guidance. First, get an honest, accurate picture of your actual caloric intake using precise tracking methods, ideally a kitchen scale for at least a period of a few weeks, rather than relying purely on visual portion estimation or memory-based tracking. Given the substantial body of research we discussed showing how easily and unconsciously actual intake tends to be underestimated, this isn't about judgment or blame. It's about closing the gap between perceived and actual intake that the research suggests is extremely common and genuinely explains a meaningful portion of unexplained plateaus. Second, pay attention to your non-exercise activity, your daily step count, or general incidental movement throughout the day, since we discussed how dramatically this can vary and how easily it tends to unconsciously decline during periods of dieting. Simple strategies like taking regular walking breaks, using a standing desk if that's accessible to you, or setting a daily step goal can help counteract the unconscious NEAT reduction that tends to accompany dieting. And this represents one of the most directly actionable levers available to you, arguably more impactful for a lot of people than adding additional structured exercise sessions specifically. Third, prioritize resistance training consistently, not just for the direct muscle building benefits we've covered extensively in previous videos, but specifically for its role in preserving and building metabolically active lean tissue, which becomes increasingly important as a genuine evidence-based countermeasure to age-related metabolic decline, distinct from the age itself is inevitably slowing everything narrative that the more rigorous recent research has actually revised. Fourth, if you're pursuing an extended weight loss phase, consider incorporating planned diet breaks, periods of returning to maintenance caloric intake for 1 to 2 weeks, both for the genuine metabolic and psychological benefits the research supports, and as a practical checkpoint to reassess your progress and recalibrate your approach based on real, observed results rather than continuing indefinitely with an approach that might benefit from periodic adjustment. Fifth, if you're experiencing persistent, unexplained difficulty with weight management alongside other symptoms that might suggest an underlying medical condition, fatigue, cold intolerance, hair changes, menstrual irregularities, or other symptoms consistent with thyroid or other endocrine dysfunction, seek proper medical evaluation rather than assuming your struggles are purely behavioral, since we discussed that genuine medical conditions, while representing a smaller proportion of cases than commonly assumed, absolutely can and do meaningfully affect metabolic rate and deserve proper diagnosis and treatment when present. And finally, hold your beliefs about your own metabolism with genuine evidence-based accuracy rather than either fatalistic pessimism or unfounded optimism. Understanding that while genuine individual variation and genuine adaptive processes during dieting are real, well-documented phenomena, the popularized, catastrophized version of starvation mode and permanently broken metabolism considerably overstates what the actual research supports for the vast majority of people pursuing reasonable, moderate approaches to weight management, rather than the extreme, prolonged, severe restriction that produced the more dramatic findings in historical research like the Minnesota starvation experiment. I want to close this out by returning to where we started. Your metabolism, for the overwhelming majority of people watching this video, is not broken. It has not been permanently damaged by past dieting attempts, even repeated ones, in the catastrophic, unfixable way the popular narrative often implies. It is not doomed to some steep, inevitable decline purely because you're getting older, at least not until considerably later in life than most people assume. And even then, the decline is meaningfully influenced by factors within your control. What's actually happening for most people who feel stuck is a combination of genuinely real but modest and largely reversible adaptive thermogenesis, an often dramatic, mostly unconscious reduction in daily incidental movement, a gap between perceived and actual caloric intake that's considerably more common and more human than most people assume, and for some people, genuine but relatively less common underlying medical factors that deserve proper diagnosis rather than either self-diagnosis or dismissal. None of this is about blame. It's about accuracy, because an accurate understanding of what's actually happening inside your body gives you something genuinely more valuable than a comforting but ultimately disempowering story about a broken system. You have no ability influence. It gives you a clear, evidence-based, and genuinely actionable path forward. Before we wrap up, if you want the complete practical toolkit for actually implementing everything we've covered today, accurate tracking systems, realistic caloric calculations tailored to your actual numbers, a sustainable approach to building resistance training and daily movement into your life, and guidance on how to structure diet breaks properly if you're pursuing an extended weight loss phase, all of that is laid out in considerably more depth in the ebooks I've linked in the description below. If you've made it this far into this video, you clearly care about actually getting to the truth of what's going on with your body rather than settling for an easy but inaccurate explanation. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource built to help you take everything we've covered today and turn it into real, sustainable progress starting today. This video discusses general metabolic and nutrition research for informational purposes only and does not constitute personalized medical or dietary advice. If you're experiencing persistent, unexplained difficulty with weight management alongside other symptoms, or if you have a history of disordered eating, consult a qualified physician or registered dietitian before making significant changes to your caloric intake or beginning a new tracking or dieting approach, since proper individualized evaluation can identify or rule out underlying medical conditions and ensure any approach you take is appropriate and safe for your specific circumstances.